Hello and welcome back to the Americano Show. Today I am delighted to be joined by Aidan McLaughlin, who was formerly a sometime contributor to The Spectator, but now has a very prestigious job as Washington correspondent for Vanity Fair magazine. And Aidan wrote an interview recently it was an interview with Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Congresswoman, who has just surprised Washington, I think it's fair to say, by abruptly announcing her resignation from Congress. And the story before that, the story that Aidan covered when he interviewed her, was her falling out with Trump, going to war with Trump over various issues. And it's a pretty interesting story because Marjorie Taylor Greene was, up until quite recently, a very staunch loyalist for Trump. So Aidan, let's get to the bottom of this. I think towards the end of your piece, you say, what is going on with Marjorie Taylor Greene? It's become an even more interesting question, I think, since your piece came out.
Yeah. So, the reason I wanted to do this interview with Marjorie Taylor Greene is that the question that has been sort of bounding around DC and beyond for the last couple of months, when anyone ever talks about politics and Trump and his sort of grip on the Republican Party, is what's going on with Marjorie Taylor Greene. People find it very hard to understand how this Congresswoman who, remember, came to power in 2020, tethering herself to Donald Trump more than any other political candidate had done before. She was such ran as a very far right Republican in the primary for her seat in Georgia, so much so that Trump didn't even endorse her. But she praised him so frequently that he ended up coming around, and they became two of the closest allies in Washington, D.C., so much so that she would wear a red MAGA hat to the State of the Union, whether it was Joe Biden's State of the Union or Donald Trump's after that, when she literally wore a hat that said Donald Trump was right about everything. So this is someone who is synonymous with support, fealty, boosterism for Donald Trump. And suddenly in the last couple of months, she started to speak out more and more against his administration on a particular set of issues, and also started to speak, I think, a little bit more moderately about politics, whether or not it was speaking about Americans suffering from a bad economy or healthcare costs rising. A lot of clips went viral in which she would talk about something very thoughtfully and quite in quite a heartfelt way. And that's just not the kind of invective, to be honest, that people were used to hearing from Marjorie Taylor Greene, whether it was calling members of Congress on the other side of the aisle traitors, or attacking Nancy Pelosi in particularly fragrant terms. It was a sea change, and I wanted to interview her to figure out what had actually happened. And there are a couple theories about what did happen there. And I think we're getting a little bit closer to really realizing and figuring out how she changed.
Do you think, in trying to put our sort of fairest hat on, do you think there is a case to be made that perhaps she was never that nutty all along? I mean, there's this famous Jewish space lasers quote, which was always sort of attached to any profile of Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I think people who like her, although I can't actually remember what her exact phrasing was or the exact details of it, say that she never really said that.
That's right. Yeah. Go ahead.
Do you think that she has been she was unfairly maligned? The old Marjorie Taylor Greene has been unfairly maligned.
I think with the way that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene are covered by the media, particularly with social media today, there are always going to be examples of when your actual words are considerably less crazy than what they are restyled as. And as a matter of fact, in my interview with Marjorie Taylor Greene, I interviewed her at her office on Capitol Hill 2 weeks ago. And she brought up that Jewish space lasers comment apropos of nothing. And she said that she never actually said that. And she is correct. If you go back and look at the record, that was a summary of her comments in a headline that was published by New York Magazine. And her actual comments were that the California wildfires that were happening at the time, back in, I think it was 2018, 2019, could have been caused by a laser set up by this energy company in coordination with the Rothschilds to pass some sort of regulation. So a baddie conspiracy theory, no doubt. With a tinge of anti-Semitism, as those tropes about the Rothschilds always do. But she didn't actually say Jewish space lasers. And I think most Americans would probably assume that she said verbatim that Jewish space lasers were being used to cause these wildfires. So I do think that in certain cases, her comments have been taken out of context. I think if you go back and look through the history of her commentary, and I did ask her about this in our interview, we're not exaggerating it. She always has been very, very extreme. She liked a series of Facebook posts. And in fact, this is what first got her stripped of her committee assignments in 2021 when CNN reported on it. She liked a bunch of Facebook posts calling for the execution of prominent Democrats. She called Nancy Pelosi in her acceptance speech for her primary victory. She called her, I don't know if I can curse on here, but she called her a bitch in the primary acceptance speech. So she was an adherent to QAnon, which is the conspiracy theory that the world is being run by a cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles. I don't think we're sort of being unfair to Marjorie when we describe her previously as a far-right extremist. I do think that her tone lately has definitely moderated.
Well, so when it comes to the falling out with Trump that we've seen in recent weeks, there are, as you say, she's started to make different noises about the economy, noises about healthcare that suggest some differences. But the real casus belli was Epstein. That's where she really her relationship with Trump seemed to snap. Is that true?
Yeah, Epstein certainly was the most, I think, potent issue with which she broke with him on. And I think that has part of that has to do with the fact that it was a very big issue for MAGA. Recall that in the run up to Donald Trump's reelection in 2024, his supporters in media, on YouTube, elsewhere, his voters really saw the Epstein issue as a powerful one. Trump actually spoke about it far less than I think people give him credit for now. He didn't really campaign on it that much. He did say that he would release the files. But everyone that's serving in his administration now would say on podcasts during the campaign that it was very important to release these files, that it would expose wrongdoing at the highest levels of the Democratic Party, obviously. And I think Marjorie Taylor Greene herself truly believed that. And so when Donald Trump came to power and then completely reversed and said that there was nothing to see here, we're not going to release the files, that was a serious issue for her. And something that I get at a little bit in the piece, which I think we have to give Marjorie Taylor Greene credit for, is the generous argument for why she has changed her stance on Trump, which is that I think a lot of people that support Trump, whether it's a cable news host or a senator, do so out of expediency. They're opportunists who realize that Trump has taken over the Republican Party by force, that there's nothing that they can do about it, and that they need to support him no matter what he says or does. For those people, when Donald Trump goes back on a promise or says that he's going to make the economy better and then ends up growing prices through tariffs, that's an excuse to prove their fealty and to say that actually this is why what Donald Trump is doing is right, because they never believed what he originally argued in the first place. Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think there's a good argument that she is a genuine, true believer. Like a lot of people that voted for Trump, she actually believes in his policies. She believes that he's fighting for the country. And so when he does do something that goes back on a promise or violates something that MAGA truly believes in because he's told them that it's important, like let's say the Epstein files, she's genuinely hurt by it and she feels genuinely betrayed. And I think that this is a bit of a case of her speaking out because she truly feels like Donald Trump has turned his back on the movement that she's dedicated her political career to.
What does she think? Did you get any sense of what she thinks the Epstein files might actually reveal?
So I asked her this. She believes, when I asked her, because the obvious question is, right, that if you're a conspiracy theorist, which she admitted in this interview that she was conspiratorial in her thinking, which I think we can all agree on. And if you're a conspiracy theorist and you're looking at the facts on the ground here, which is that Donald Trump was friends with Jeffrey Epstein for decades. They were very, very close. They exchanged a crude birthday card. Donald Trump put the man who gave Jeffrey Epstein his first sweetheart plea deal in Florida in his cabinet as labor secretary. And now Donald Trump is in control of the Epstein files and he's doing everything in his power to stop their release. If you're a conspiracy theorist, I would come to the conclusion that Donald Trump might have something to hide here. And so my question to her is, how can you look at this great body of evidence, knowing that you have a conspiratorial mindset about things, and not ask questions of Donald Trump that you would ask of anyone else, which is, what are you hiding here? And her argument, which is, I don't think an invalid one, and there's a certain amount of weight to this, is that she has spent a lot of time with Epstein's accusers. And I think it's very powerful to hear Marjorie Taylor Greene, of all people, talk about Epstein's accusers, because she talks about them in a very empathetic way. And what she says is that time and time again, she's asked them, Democrats certainly who have met with them privately have asked them, is there any evidence against Donald Trump, either in the Epstein files that you've heard about? Did Donald Trump ever abuse you, or have you ever heard of Donald Trump abusing anyone? And they all say that no, he hasn't. Now, that doesn't mean that Donald Trump has never had an accusation against him related to Epstein. In fact, a model that Epstein had dated in the 1990s said that she was aggressively groped by Donald Trump while Epstein looked on and laughed back in the 1990s. But of the women that are involved in the case against Epstein, the sex trafficking case against Epstein that the Southern District of New York brought before his death back in 2019, none of those women say that Donald Trump abused them, according to Marjorie Taylor Greene. And to her, that is enough to not have to ask questions of him. That said, she did raise the question of why his administration is fighting so hard to keep this hidden, and whether or not that means that there's anything else in it, whether it's wrongdoing against people that the administration is trying to protect, foreign governments. She's big on suggesting that Israel might have something to do with this, given Jeffrey Epstein's ties to the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and intelligence services. So she's raising a lot of questions, and like everyone, she thinks that the only way to answer these questions is to actually have these files released.
Yes, we should say, because we don't want $1 billion lawsuit from Donald Trump, we should say that he does deny writing that card, doesn't he, still? And he has...
Donald Trump denies writing that card, and I should also say that the model that accused him of groping her, his spokesperson, Caroline Levitt, has denied that as well, including any allegations that have been made against him.
Important to clarify. But you mentioned Israel there, and I think that's beyond the Epstein files. I called them the casus belli between Marjorie Taylor Greene and Trump. The real story actually is about an America First foreign policy and its relationship to Israel, which has been which is emerging as a sort of fault line in MAGA. There's a lot of talk about Nick Fuentes at the moment, and this famous interview he did with Tucker Carlson where they discussed this. And it's possible that actually the fallout between Marjorie Taylor Greene and Trump, while Epstein seems to be a big part of it, it's really about the strike on Iran and the sense among a lot of people who support Marjorie Taylor Greene and who did support Donald Trump that he is betraying an America First foreign policy agenda.
Right. So this is another case where the actual practical administration of President Donald Trump, a lot of people in MAGA see it as diverting from the promises that he made. Donald Trump, as we all know, ran as the America First candidate in all three elections that he's run in. And what a lot of his supporters took that to mean was that, one, there would be no foreign intervention, and two, that we would not be funding foreign wars. So obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United States has supported Ukraine a great deal with arms and money, and also Israel's war on Gaza. The United States sends billions of dollars to Israel over the years. Marjorie Taylor Greene is staunchly opposed to that, and Donald Trump's fairly unreserved support for Israel has been a big issue for her, and a big issue for MAGA. I think for the first time in probably American history, we're seeing conservatives break with Israel in a way they haven't before. And I think you can trace a lot of that back to Donald Trump running as an America First candidate and then supporting Israel, and also supporters of Israel being very insistent upon American support for this foreign country. So, and you look at polls right now and you look at younger conservatives in polls. I saw a poll from this week. Younger conservatives are more sympathetic to the Palestinians than they are to the Israelis, which was genuinely shocking to see. So I think that's a really big issue. Another thing that I think is really important for Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she told me this in our interview, is that she's a mother of three. And I asked her why she started speaking out against Israel, expecting her to give me a harsh sort of realpolitik argument about why the United States should be taking care of itself before supporting a foreign country. She actually gave me an argument about how heartbreaking it was for her to see dead children in Gaza. And she spoke about those children in Gaza in a way that felt genuinely empathetic. And I was a little shocked by it because it's, for two reasons. One, it's hard to, it's rare that you hear a politician talk about anyone with genuine empathy and not feigned empathy. But two, it's also very shocking to hear a Republican talk about Israel's war in Gaza, describe it explicitly as a genocide, and then also talk about the human toll there and about how she couldn't support that. And she then brought it back to the problems in the United States. She talked about how when she drives through her district in Georgia, she sees factories littered like graveyards, is the way she described it, around her district. And she just couldn't fathom why we would be spending money to support something that she described as a genocide. And, we're bombing children and starving children when there are such steep problems in her hometown, which are also not being remedied by Donald Trump's economic policy. So it really is a sort of like holistic, wholesale, almost come to Jesus moment where she's realizing that the promises that Donald Trump made her that she fought so hard for are going up in smoke. And we're almost reckoning with that real time. And then, of course, Donald Trump turns on her and it sort of spirals out of control.
I think factories littered like graveyards or gravestones is a quotation or reference to Trump's 2016 America Carnage speech, which is quite interesting because if she is this sort of emerging as this representative of the original MAGA movement, that does set up what a lot of people are speculating, the possibility of a Marjorie Taylor Greene presidential run in 2028. Do you think that's a realistic possibility? And do you think she could have any success?
So I asked her about whether she planned on running in 2028, and she gave me a very predictable politician's answer. She said, I haven't thought about running in 2028. And I kept asking her if she would ever consider it, and she begged off. So for now, she's at least, keeping her feet dry and not wading into that. I spoke with, actually, a few minutes before we hopped on here, I spoke with a top Trump ally who knows Marjorie Taylor Greene very, very well. And they said that the reason that she resigned here is not necessarily to set up a future run, although that's always on the cards, but it's because she feared the battering that going through another election in Georgia in the midterms would be like. Now, she is still very, very popular in Georgia. She likely would have won re-election in 2026. But this source described the fight between her and Trump as being a bloodbath. If she had decided to run again, Trump would have dumped millions of dollars into a primary opponent. She would have faced a number of opponents all vying for Donald Trump's support, which would have given that race a ton of attention. And she would have been running as Donald Trump's most fervent supporter, who he is constantly posting is a traitor. So what they said is that there's no real play here. She just didn't want to go through that. She's tired. She gave a lot to this man and his movement, and he turned on her and is attacking her every time she pops up in the press. And so she just couldn't go through with that. Now, she's going to have a lot of time on her hands now that she's quitting Congress, and there's certainly speculation that she might run for governor, that she might take a job in the media, bide her time, and run for re-election, or run for election as president down the line. As far as whether she could do it, after Donald Trump got elected president in 2016, after being a sort of funny reality TV star for most of his career, I never rule any candidate for president out ever. I think they all can win. And that should scare us a little bit, but also keep us a little excited.
Yeah. Well, the most likely candidate, and the one that everybody expected to be, is, of course, J.D. Vance, the vice president. And his relationship with Marjorie Taylor Greene is quite interesting because he has come under some pressure, I think, to criticize her in the past. And he's always rather assiduously flattered her in public. And of course, with my sort of racehorse hat on, I'm thinking, perhaps she could be an interesting running mate for him. If he's going to pivot towards the centre, she could potentially bring MAGA along with her if he wants to pitch himself as a more moderate candidate, and particularly on this thorny issue of Israel that seems to be causing so much aggravation.
Right. I would also note that that goes both ways. Marjorie Taylor Greene got asked in an interview with Tim Dillon, the comedian, about he posited that she was more the inheritor of MAGA than even JD Vance was. And she brushed that off and was very clear about the fact that she loves JD Vance, even as Donald Trump was attacking her. So they're both quite close allies. I think that does make things a little bit awkward for JD Vance right now. But certainly, I think that could definitely be she could definitely be JD Vance's running mate. It depends whether and what kind of race JD Vance wants to run, whether he does want to moderate and have someone who's true MAGA on the side. I also think it depends whether or not Donald Trump is going to play a role in selecting who his heir is going to be. And right now, at least, there's always the chance that, this is one big show of The Apprentice, right? So Donald Trump can turn on someone, call them a traitor, and a year down the line, turn around and say that they're the only person who can succeed him as president. So I think there's entirely a world in which Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene, between now and the 2028 election, which is a long time away, could make up, and Marjorie Taylor Greene could become a star of the MAGA movement. So I think that's entirely impossible, and I think that would open up the door for her to have a more pronounced public profile. For now, I think she's probably going to lay low and continue talking about the fact that she is fighting for the true MAGA movement, and Donald Trump is betraying it. And we'll see how much Trump responds to that.
Another aspect I wanted to ask you about, lastly, Aidan, is if you look at the sort of non-Trump supporting media and the way they've treated Marjorie Taylor Greene up until very recently, and this is perhaps a sort of paranoid right-wing point, but it is the case that she was dismissed as a ridiculous fringe figure and so on. And then as soon as she starts criticizing Donald Trump, she is suddenly converted into, this rational, calm, clear-minded person. It's quite extraordinary the way a lot of journalists can just completely reframe their understanding of people, isn't it?
I mean, the media loves nothing more than a convert. Yeah, I think the easiest way to get on The View is to get famous as an extremist and then moderate and start talking about how Donald Trump doesn't know what he's talking about. Yeah, I mean, I think, the media figures are the most naive people on the planet, as we both know. So I think they're willing to eat this kind of stuff up. I did make that point to her when we were talking that there does seem to be a new way to make it in American politics, whether deliberate or not, which is achieve an enormous amount of fame as an extremist, right? Which is what Marjorie Taylor Greene did. She, I would guess, has more CNN headlines than almost anyone on the Republican side of the aisle in Congress, only to moderate and generate more headlines, with the headline now being what happened to Marjorie Taylor Greene. And now suddenly we're all talking about how she's a 2028 prospect. And I think it's not just on the Republican side. You also see that among Democrats. I mean, Jack Schlossberg, the Kennedy scion, right, got famous because he started posting really weird Instagram videos, and he gained a certain amount of fame and notoriety as a weirdo. And now he's moderating and doing very serious interviews with the New York Times, 5,000 word profiles written by Maureen Dowd, and he's running for Congress. So I do think it's a sort of alarming but potentially successful way to make it in America now, which is to gain fame and notoriety as a quack, only to moderate and have the media take you seriously, because we live in a media ecosystem now where consequences for unhinged behavior are no longer really present, and the guardrails have sort of fallen off, because at the end of the day, you don't need the Washington Post editorial page to bless your campaign. You can achieve all this fame on social media, and so the guardrails aren't really there anymore. And I think that means that you're going to see a lot of candidates for office take that route of getting attention on the fringes, only to moderate and be taken seriously by a media that doesn't really have the power to rule you out anymore.
That's an absolutely fascinating point. I suppose it's triangulation, you might call it, for the digital age.
Yeah, that's right. We should give it a shot, Freddie. I think we have a bright future if we start getting really, really weird.
Yeah, we'll set up a sort of PR consulting firm for people that want to do it. Yeah.
Read about the space lasers.
Yeah. Aidan, thank you very much for coming on to Americano. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you, and congratulations on the new job, and keep up the great work.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it.